So my name is David van Valkenburg. I am currently a teacher of mathematics at the Isch, but in a previous life, not so long ago, I was a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Western Australia. Well, if you don't sleep, you die. There's that. No neuroscientist in the world, or at least when I was in neuroscience a few years ago, can tell you exactly why we sleep or exactly what sleep is for, but I can say quite conclusively that if you do not sleep, then you will eventually die, usually of psychosis. After a few days of not getting any REM sleep, you start to exhibit signs of paranoia and delusion, and after about a week or 2 weeks of not getting sleep, you develop full-blown psychosis, and eventually you will die. Sleep is important because you need it to live. Well, other than survival, sleep, again, not much is known about what actually happens with sleep. It's believed to be a bit of a restorative process in your brain, but the data doesn't really support that, because if you do brain scans or you analyze the activity in the brain during sleep, it's actually the same levels of activity that you see during wakefulness. So the brain isn't any more or any less active during sleep. So the idea that it's resting doesn't actually make sense. So what it does do is, or one product of sleeping, is it actually allows you to consolidate memories. And what that means is things that you have learned during the day, when you learn them, are only represented in your brain in what's called short-term memory stores. And somehow, and nobody really knows how, the process of sleep, and in particular the process of REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement, actually enables your brain to transfer those memories from short-term memory to long-term memory, and that way you'll be able to remember it on your next test. So a good night's sleep before test is actually more important than staying up late and studying, it turns out. Again, the process of sleep, not well known. The best people have is they hook the brain up to different kinds of EEG, which is electroencephalograms, which are basically electrodes that are placed on your scalp, and they measure an average amount of electrical activity at the point of where they're placed on your scalp. And if you place those all over the scalp and measure electrical activity, then you find that there is a pattern of activity, and we call these patterns waves. There are different kinds of waves. We have beta waves, gamma waves, alpha waves, and different kinds of brain wave activity, which is just an average of 100 billion neurons in your brain that are all firing simultaneously. Different kinds of waves, that slow versus fast, large versus small, are associated with different kinds of sleep. And so you can hook someone up to an electroencephalogram, or an animal, a mammal, and you can know what stage of sleep they're in by the average level of activity in their brain. But there is nobody who really knows what that means. It's more like an identification. It's a marker. We can say they're in REM sleep, we can say they're in their beta waves, but we don't have any idea why that's the average electrical activity, and we don't know what it means. Or at least they didn't. Yeah, so I don't remember the actual numbers, so I can't say after 3 days, it's after 2 or 3 days is when you start to develop what would look like, if you went into a clinical psychologist, what would look like psychosis. So delusions, voices, hearing voices, paranoia about everyone out to get you, those kinds of feelings start to take hold after 2 or 3 days. After 2 or 3 weeks, you are literally a babbling nutcase. It's not a scientific term, of course, but you are in full-blown psychosis. You are the equivalent of someone who is absolutely insane, where you have no connection with reality at all. And that it usually leads to unconsciousness, which then is sleep, but if you prevent that, then death. The absence of consciousness really is the only way, but then that doesn't actually cover everything, because you can have absence of consciousness and not have your brain be exhibiting the waveforms that are associated with sleep. So I think the way that cognitive psychologists or neuroscientists tend to define sleep is by the average activity of the brain waves. They do it by whether or not you're exhibiting gamma waves or beta waves or alpha waves, etc. But it's really fuzzy because if you define it as the lack of consciousness, you then have to define consciousness. And nobody can define consciousness. It's that thing that we all believe we have, but nobody knows. And I would actually argue we don't, but that's a whole other interview. To survive. Again, it's one of those, to consolidate memories, presumably the brain is doing some housekeeping, you can think of it as like refiling. In the course of a day, you stubbed your toe this morning, you had something for breakfast, you saw a face of somebody you didn't know on the bus, 1,000 trillion things happened to you today. Tomorrow you're only going to remember a very small proportion of it. During your sleep is sort of when some part of your brain is taking the memories from the day before that had emotional significance, because if it doesn't have emotional significance, it doesn't get remembered, and is filing those in a different spot in your brain, and everything else then sort of gets purged. But the process is, we don't understand. Anyone claims they know the answer to that question, be suspicious. If you think of things in terms of a Venn diagram, dreaming is inside of sleeping. You can be dreaming, you can be sleeping without dreaming, but you can't be dreaming without sleeping. So dreaming is a very, very small, in terms of the proportion of time, it's a very small portion of your sleep. If you sleep for an 8-hour night, generally speaking, your brain will go into what's called REM sleep, which is short for rapid eye movement, which is when your eyes start to move. If you've ever seen your mother, father, brother, sister sleeping and their eyes are like going crazy underneath their eyelids, that means that's when they're dreaming. And that only happens for a few minutes every couple of hours, every hour, every 90 minutes, something like that. It's in a cycle every 70 or 80 or 90 minutes, depending on the person. And it's a very short period of time. And in those short periods of time, those are when you're dreaming. No one has ever reported, to my knowledge, reported a dream that they didn't just have rapid eye movement beforehand in research settings. So it feels like you dream all night, but you actually only dream for very, very, very small portions. And usually just as you're waking up is your last bout of REM sleep, and that's why those are the vivid ones that you wake up with, oh, I had this crazy dream. Usually happens in that last period of REM sleep. Acknowledge that you're screwed. The system is set up against you. As a teenager, you're basically at the point in your life where you require way more sleep than adults do. It's just that's how your brains are wired. You actually, as a teenager, require approximately 9 hours of sleep a night to be healthy, and you don't get it. None of you do. And the reason you don't get it is because of selfish adults. It's a well-known fact that as the teenager brain enters puberty, what happens is you want to stay up later, and that's actually hardwired, and you want to sleep later. And it's not because you're lazy kids, it's not because it's good TV on at night, it's actually just the way you're wired. 200 years ago before TV, that's what kids were doing too, or teenagers were doing too. Back then, of course, they could just sleep in, and they actually were allowed to sleep in a bit because sleep was important. What happens now is you stay up late, and then we force you to come to school at 8:30 in the morning, which means we force you to get up way earlier than you want to, and we don't let you get enough sleep. There's been a few schools in the United States and in other Western countries, private schools, who have experimented with starting school at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning instead of 8:30. Everyone's marks went up. My advice is deal with it and go to bed earlier if you can, but you probably can't.